Let me start with an introduction to where I'm going here. For those of you who are seeing this through my blog page, this is going to be a continuation of some of the comments that I've made elsewhere. For those of you who are seeing it directly at Vimeo or through Facebook, this is part of my blog. For those of you seeing it at YouTube, just wanted to get all that out of the way so you understand that this is being uploaded in various locations, because what I have to say is important enough to me that I really want to make sure it gets as broad an audience as possible. So if you're intrigued by what I have to say, I'd appreciate it if you'd share this with other people. Anyway, some of you know that in addition to my career as a filmmaker, I'm also a film critic or media critic, have been for quite a while. And the question I want to deal with is datedness, or to put it in a different way, as the title of this video suggests, the 4 phases of popular culture. Now, by popular culture, I mean fashion, I mean movies, I mean culture that's produced for an immediate effect and which hopefully will gratify audiences right away. So the first of the 4 phases of popular culture is novelty. I don't think this is very controversial, that some new product, new idea, new way of making a movie, new subject matter appears, is successful, and then spawns a host of imitators. I would say that to say that novelty is part of the cycle of pop culture is a little misleading, however, for reasons I'll get into at the very end. But novelty, pretty much straightforward, non-controversial. The second phase of popular culture is perhaps the most important because it's also the most controversial. I would call this the period of acceptance and invisibility, by which I mean that a fashion, a technique, whatever, becomes pervasive enough that you cease to notice it. Now, fashion provides the most obvious example of this, where a particular way of dressing, doing your hair, whatever, becomes popular. Everyone's doing it. You accept it as true. So that, for example, if you're watching a movie that has a contemporary setting, let's say in 2013, that you expect the realism to reflect the fact that people are going to be dressing in a particular way. That is, in fact, what I mean by invisibility, because even though it is a product of fashion, it's fashion that's conceived in order not to be seen. There's no paradox here, because even though fashion flatters people into thinking of themselves as individuals, in fact, the real message of fashion is if you dress this way, you're going to be like everybody else. You'll be accepted. You'll be part of the group, even though the thrust of the ad is to tell you how distinctive you will be. So that's the reality of fashion, and the reality of the second phase of popular culture is simply to be invisible, to be there because everybody else accepts it, and therefore you accept it. Now, the third phase of popular culture is what I call the camp phase. We're all familiar with this. Those of you who are old enough, think of photos of yourself taken, say, 20 years earlier, where you look at the way you're dressed, the way your hair is cut and whatever, and you laugh. You laugh because the fashions have changed, and what seemed so real and so perfect 20 years ago suddenly seems like a joke. So the third phase is to patronize and make fun of your own past, if you will. It becomes popular again as a joke. It's no longer a question of being popular as an invisible background. It's popular as something to make fun of, to make you feel superior to the movie, to the dress, to whatever you're talking about that is no longer in fashion and demonstrates its datedness. The fourth and final phase of popular culture is what I call the antique phase, the fetishization of things from the past precisely because they are old. And this is an interesting phase because not all artifacts achieve it, but many do. And so what had at one point been an element of fashion, then patronized as camp, acquires new value as a relic of a particular age. And in the process, frequently, an accompanying part of this is that as it becomes an antique in the broad sense, it now gets elevated to a level of importance that it did not enjoy when it was new or invisible. In other words, the popular suddenly becomes elitist. If you want an example of this, watch your average episode of Antiques Roadshow, where frequently the artifacts that are discussed as valuable are very trivial things that, 50, 100 years before might have been viewed as little more than a toy or just something that you could easily throw away, but for whatever reason has become a collector's item and therefore is valuable and then taken seriously. This also happens in terms of things like decorative arts, so that, for example, Art Deco, which today is recognized as a very important 20th century decorative movement, at the time that it was new, tended to be looked down upon by people as cheap and shoddy and theatrical and not really to be taken seriously. So the antique phase is the last phase. But it leads into the single most important thing about popular culture, which is that the more things change, the more things remain the same. And another aphorism of my own, if you want to look as if you're ahead of the times, just be so far behind that nobody notices. Because the truth of popular culture is that there is very little ever that's new. It is just simply a recycling, a retreading of things that have happened in the past, frequently by people who are too young to know that it was in the past, or even when it is self-consciously done to evoke the past, doing it in a way that is just different enough that it can claim to be new. The bottom line in all of this is all part of the cycles of capitalism. It's all part of the need to differentiate products, the need to produce the illusion of individuality where none exists. It's all part of the effort to make people feel superior to the very products that they're being sold. In other words, the product is sold to you to make you feel like you're really smart, when in fact, by buying it, you're proving that you're not so smart. You're getting sucked in by these cycles, which are constantly being churned and recycled to provide the illusion of novelty. And one last point that's worth remembering is that in that second phase, when an artifact or a fashion is working in the background and is theoretically invisible, that to call attention to that is to call attention to the cycles of coercion that are involved. In other words, when people go to a movie and they praise it for being just like life, in fact, they're victims of a stylization that is only revealed later as the fashions and expectations move on to something else. So in other words, realism as a style is very powerful at the moment the artifact is created and seen. Once times move on, the style is revealed. And at that point, you suddenly recognize that, oh, you know what? This is all just a manufacture.